Good morning. Very nice. In 2004, we began what has become one of Roxbury Latin's proudest traditions. Since the inception of the F. Washington Jarvis International Fund Lecture, we have welcomed 21 distinguished public servants and thinkers on foreign affairs, including the economist Paul Volcker, Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense, Lisa Monaco, Homeland Security Advisor to President Obama, John Brennan, former Director of the CIA, Professor Bill Taubman, who spoke to us about Russian and U.S. relations over many decades, Ambassador Harriet Elam Thomas, who reminded us of the critical role of diverse perspectives in the work of foreign affairs, Dr. Javier Corrales, who spoke with us about democracy in Latin America, David Diaz, who provided a stellar example of a career committed to national security, foreign policy, and public service. And last year, Dr. Nima Mazahiri, who spoke on oil and energy politics in the Middle East. Today, we host the 22nd Annual Jarvis Fund Lecture, named for the man who for 30 years led Roxbury Latin as its 10th headmaster, the Reverend Tony Jarvis, who passed away 7 years ago. All of us associated with Roxbury Latin owe Tony Jarvis a debt of gratitude for making Roxbury Latin the school that it is today. And we are so glad to have this lecture named for him as one way to remind us in perpetuity of his lasting impact. The genesis of this fund was twofold. First, the appreciation that alumnus Jack Hennessy, class of 1954, and his wife Margarita had for the distinguished work that Mr. Jarvis did during his time here. And second, their conviction that Americans in general, and Roxbury Latin's teachers and students in particular, could benefit from greater exposure to issues concerning the United States' place in the world. They envisioned this fund helping to bring to the school distinguished thinkers on world affairs, as well as enabling our boys and faculty to experience firsthand, by sending them out into the world, cultures different from our own. Since the fund was established in 2004, hundreds of boys and faculty members have been afforded the opportunity to travel to foreign countries. As a result, they, and you, have developed new perspectives on many political, economic, historical, and cultural issues. We were glad this past spring and summer to continue the various trips that have become a hallmark of RL's program. Class 3 and 2 boys practicing the Spanish and French languages they're so effectively taught during immersion trips to France and Spain. 50s spending several days in Canada during March break. And our Glee Club regularly touring during spring break, performing in cities near and far, including in Austria and the Czech Republic and Italy just a few years ago. And our RL faculty have routinely benefited from educational forays to distant places. In order to provide a sense of the impact that our commitment to foreign travel has had on this community, I would now ask boys and teachers if during your time at this school you have traveled to a foreign country on trips sponsored by Roxbury Latin to please stand. Thank you. It's an important part of who we are as a school. And finally today, I want to recognize Jack and Margarita Hennessy, who unfortunately couldn't be with us this morning. Mr. Hennessy is a member of the class of 1954 and a former member of Roxbury Latin's Board of Trustees. Both he and his wife have throughout their lives represented an unusual engagement with other nations and cultures. Throughout their lives, too, they have generously provided the philanthropic support in order that others might come to know and appreciate various corners of our increasingly interconnected world. And as we all know, they have helped to make possible in the IAF, the Hennessy Rink, home of our hockey program. This morning, we are honored to have with us as Roxbury Latin's 22nd Jarvis Lecturer, Dr. Christopher Miller. Dr. Miller's book, Chip War, The fight for the world's most critical technology, which he will speak with us about today, reveals the geopolitical impact of the computer chip. As he shows, the international dynamics of computer chip technology have transformed semiconductors from a basic commodity into a critical strategic asset at the center of our global power struggle, particularly between the United States and China. Chip War is a New York Times bestseller and a winner of the Financial Times Business Book of the Year Award. Dr. Miller is a professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C. He is frequently featured in media such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, as well as on NPR and CNBC. In addition to Chip War, Dr. Miller has written 3 books about the political and economic history of Russia, including Putinomics, Power and Money and Research in Russia. Dr. Miller earned his master's and doctorate in history from Yale and his bachelor's degree in history from Harvard. Please join me in welcoming to Roxbury Latin this morning an impressive writer, teacher, and thinker about historical and current day effects on our global economy, Dr. Christopher Miller.
You all today at an institution that takes its traditions very seriously. I had a chance earlier to learn a bit more about Reverend Jarvis, the institution that he built. And I'd like to speak with you today about a tradition that you might not recognize, in part because you think it is a tradition with a recent history, but in fact has a history spreading back over 75 years. This is a tradition that gets to the core of American statecraft, the core of America's role in the world, explains the dynamics shaping our economy and all of international politics, that reaches into the depths of the biggest companies in the world, but also all the way into your pocket. This is the tradition of harnessing computing power. Now, most of you probably don't spend much time thinking about semiconductors, the tiny computer chips that power everything from your smartphones to the world's largest data centers. But what I'd like to suggest to you is that you cannot understand the world today without putting computer chips at the center of your analysis. What I'd like to argue is that the shape of the world economy, the balance of military power, and the future of the world's most important technologies, including artificial intelligence, depend fundamentally on their ability to harness and develop even more capable semiconductors. Today there are chips in almost everything, not just your smartphones, but in dishwashers, in cars, in robots, in drones, in industrial equipment, in medical devices, of course, in computers, in the telecoms network, and in the data centers that train and deploy artificial intelligence systems. I would posit that none of you can spend even an hour of your waking life without interacting with not just hundreds, but thousands of semiconductors, the dozens of chips in your smartphone, the thousands and thousands of chips in the telecoms network that transmit your Instagram likes and your text messages to your friends, and the millions now of chips deployed in the data centers that process and store an increasing volume of the data that you produce and take advantage of. All this requires increasingly capable semiconductors to enable. So what is a chip? What is a semiconductor? It's a small piece of material, usually silicon, with thousands, millions, now often billions of tiny circuits carved into a chip. And so if you take your smartphone out of your pocket and pop it open, you'll find dozens of different semiconductor devices inside, all of which do very different things. There's a chip that manages the camera, a chip that turns your voice into a long string of ones and zeros that can be processed, a different chip that connects your phone to the Wi-Fi network, a different chip as well that connects to the Bluetooth network. There's a chip that connects to the cellular network. There's a chip that knows whether your phone is held like this or like this. There are memory chips, there are processor chips, and just the most important chip inside your phone, the chip that runs the operating system that your phone requires, is one of the most complex and sophisticated devices ever produced by humans. A new phone will have a processor chip with 20 billion tiny devices called transistors carved in a piece of silicon the size of your fingernail. What's a transistor? It's a switch that turns a circuit on or off. On or off. When a circuit is on, it produces a 1. When it's off, it produces a 0. And all of the ones and zeros in the digital world, all your text messages, all of your Instagram likes, all of your Word documents, every phone call you make, these are all strings of ones and zeros produced now by the billions by all of the semiconductors that you use. And to fit 20 billion little switches called transistors onto a piece of silicon the size of your fingernail requires the most complex manufacturing humans have ever undertaken. Because 20 billion transistors in a tiny chip requires each one of the transistors to be smaller than the size of a coronavirus. In other words, every time you take your phone out of your pocket, you're wielding the benefits of manufacturing that can produce devices at virus size by the billions. There's nothing you use more of in your life than transistors. They're everywhere around you by the millions and billions, and yet you never think about them. And you don't think about them because they're so cheap, they can be put in almost everything. There's nothing you bought at lower price than the price of a transistor inside your phone or your computer. And because they're so cheap, we deploy them in all manner of devices. It was only just 30 years ago when it was possible, for example, to buy a car without hardly any computing power inside of it. Today, a new car will have, on average, 1,000 semiconductors inside, managing the autonomous driving systems, making the connection with GPS networks, but also moving your windshield wipers back and forth, or the window up and down. All that today is managed by transistors, harnessing computing power to automatically undertake the actions you wish to take. And so our entire world, our entire industrial base, our homes, our schools, our workplaces today are structured by many thousands of pieces of silicon which knit them together, allow them to communicate, and undertake actions on our behalf. Our economy can't function without semiconductors, which is why the largest companies in the world today are semiconductor companies. Take the most valuable company in the world, NVIDIA, a company worth $4 trillion. It designs semiconductors. If you look at the list of the 10 largest companies in the world, from NVIDIA to Broadcom, from Taiwan Semiconductor to Google, from Meta to Microsoft, these are companies that all design chips and all couldn't function without semiconductors. The big tech firms that we spend so much of our lives engaging with are companies that couldn't exist without the computing power that semiconductors enable. Whether it's Microsoft or Meta, their largest expenditure each year is expenditure buying semiconductors to put in data centers to run all of the programs and apps that you rely on. It's difficult to imagine a modern economy, impossible, I would say, without semiconductors. Which means that understanding how they are produced is central to understanding the modern world. And the supply chain that enables us to manufacture semiconductors is at such a tiny scale, but by the billions, is itself the most complex supply chain that humans have ever put together. Take the primary chip inside of your smartphone. It was almost certainly designed by a firm in the United States, probably in Silicon Valley, Apple, for example, or Qualcomm, using intellectual property from companies both in the United States and Europe. And it was etched into a silicon wafer. And the silicon wafer was highly likely to have been produced in Japan, where a small number of companies have the capability to produce silicon with the requisite degree of purity. And just think about the level of purity that's required in the materials to manufacture at virus scale. Viruses are measured, just like semiconductors, in billions of a meter, nanometers. And nanometers are so small that if you misplace a single atom at times in the manufacturing process, you can have defects in the way that your semiconductors work. So all of the materials involved in the manufacturing process must be 99.9999999% pure, 10 nines, as it's known in the industry. And there's very few companies in the world that know how to produce silicon with the requisite level of purity. But that's just the raw material. Then you have to make the chip. You have to acquire machines that are capable of manufacturing at virus scale as well. And these machines are the most complicated machines humans have ever made. There are deposition machines that deposit thin films of material as thin as a single atom thick. There are etching machines that can etch tiny canyons in silicon that are also just a couple of atoms wide. There are metrology machines that can look at a chip with 20 billion transistors and identify which ones will work and which ones will not. Virus scale inspection itself is an extraordinarily difficult challenge. And the most complex machine of all the machines used to manufacture semiconductors are called extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, EUV lithography for short. These are the tools that pattern where each of the 20 billion transistors in your smartphone chip ought to go. And to pattern these, you need to shoot rays of light at a piece of silicon that react in the right way to carve out transistors on your chip. And yet normal rays of light are insufficiently precise to carve the tiny transistors that you rely on. Most rays of light that we can see are measured in hundreds of nanometers, depending on the color. But the chips inside of your phones and computers and data centers are measured in dozens of nanometers. In other words, the light that you see is too wide to carve the tiny chips in your phones and computers. And so we use a special type of light called extreme ultraviolet light to carve the transistors in the chips. It's produced inside of a vast machine that costs $350 million a piece to purchase. These machines take a ball of tin and strike it twice with the most powerful laser ever deployed in a commercial device. The ball of tin explodes into a plasma that measures 40 or 50 times hotter than the surface of the sun. The plasma emits light at just the right wavelength, 13.5 nanometers, to bounce off a dozen of the flattest mirrors humans have ever made and land on a piece of silicon with perfect precision to carve each of the 20 billion transistors that your smartphone requires. I would posit to you that no other type of manufacturing comes remotely close to the complexity that's necessary to make chips. And because it's so complex, no country can do it on their own. There's one company in the world that makes these extreme ultraviolet lithography tools. It's called ASML, based in the Netherlands. But they in turn require a supply chain that stretches across the United States and Japan to secure all of the ultra-precise materials that are necessary to make these machines. And many of the other tools that are used in the chip-making process are equally complicated and require equally far-flung supply chains, knitting together Europe, the United States, and Japan. And every year, these tools have to get better, because every year, the quality of chips gets better. In a trend known as Moore's Law, named after one of the key figures in the early days of the chip industry, Gordon Moore, the quality of chips almost doubles every 2 years. Nothing else in human society has ever doubled every 2 years. Across the economy, productivity grows at a couple percentage points a year. GDP grows only slightly faster if we're lucky, and it often grows more slowly. If a company increases its sales by 10% a year, it feels itself lucky. But in the chip industry, unless you double in capability every 2 years, you've fallen far, far behind. And this doubling every 2 years, which has happened since the 1960s, has enabled the extraordinary computing that we today take for granted. It's why your smartphone has 1 million times the computing power as the spacecraft that guided the Apollo astronauts to the moon. It's why today we can put computing in everything, because it's so easy to produce at vast scale and at low cost. And we can be highly confident that in 2 years we'll have twice as capable chips. And in 4 years, we'll have doubled yet again. A doubling which will continue to transform our economy, but will also be particularly important for the most significant trend in computing today, which is artificial intelligence. Now, if you log on to ChatGPT and ask it what drives improvements in artificial intelligence, it will tell you, and I've tried, about algorithms, about brilliant computer scientists, about Sam Altman's genius, about all the data that has been harvested. But if you look historically, the key driver of advances in AI, from when the term was first coined in the 1950s all the way up to the present, has been the ability to harness more computing power. The most advanced algorithms that are deployed today in AI systems were trained by reading essentially all of the text on the internet. That's how ChatGPT works. It read out all the pages in Wikipedia. It read all the books like Google Books that it could get its hands on. It read thousands and thousands of pages on Reddit. People wonder why it hallucinates. And from studying all of this text, it now is able to produce language not all that dissimilar from our own. It would have been impossible just 10 years ago to read all the text on the internet and identify patterns from them, because we simply did not have enough. And today, all of the world's technology companies, from OpenAI to Anthropic, from Google to Alibaba, they're all making the same bet, that better AI systems in the future will require even more computing power. Which is why the world's largest technology companies today are spending tens of billions of dollars each quarter investing in more computing, bigger data centers, more advanced semiconductors to train and deploy better AI systems. Because whether it's Sam Altman or Elon Musk, whether it's anyone you can think of in the technology sector, they're all making the same bet. Better AI requires more computing power. More computing power requires more advanced semiconductors. And this is a bet that is being made not only by technology companies, but also, I would argue to you, by countries. The United States, since the invention of the first chips, which happened in Texas and in California in the late 1950s, has, over the last 75 years, been the leader in deploying computing power to all aspects of the country. Our economy, as I mentioned, has been transformed by computing power. The rise of big technology companies has been enabled by more and more computing. But so too our defense and intelligence capabilities increasingly rely on advanced computing and AI. And this is nothing new. The first chips that were invented in the late 1950s and early 1960s were used both to guide spacecraft, but also to guide nuclear missiles. There's been a deep interconnection between our defense capabilities and advances in computing power. That was true during the Cold War, and it's no less true today. Go to the Pentagon, you'll find dozens of influential teams that are trying to harness data to improve their sensing capabilities or to better target their adversaries. The military is using AI to track submarines underwater, to interpret satellite photos, and to make sense of electronic spectrum data that they're acquiring. And the same is true of our adversaries. In the Russia-Ukraine war, for example, Russia's already deploying semi-autonomous drones to strike Ukrainian targets, using AI and computer vision to send drones on missions and often letting them select targets without human intervention. In other words, the world's militaries are betting that AI won't just be for chatbots. It'll also be for war, which means that access to the most advanced AI capabilities and the most capable AI ecosystems will, I think, be a future critical input into the future geopolitical balance. And I'm not the only person who thinks that. US leaders have articulated the same view for now over a decade, and so too has China, where leaders in China are betting just as much on deploying AI systems to defense applications. But here's where the semiconductor supply chain is fundamentally important. Today, if you want to make an advanced semiconductor, you do so almost exclusively using intellectual property, know-how, tools, and materials from Western countries. Extreme ultraviolet lithography tools from the Netherlands. Silicon wafers from Japan. Chip designs and intellectual property from US companies. China plays a tiny role today in the semiconductor supply chain. Most of the key process steps are monopolized by the United States, by Europe, by Japan, or by Taiwan. And it's Taiwan that stands in the most vulnerable position in the entire semiconductor supply chain. Because although many of the components in chip manufacturing, as I've laid out for you, come from Europe, the US, or Japan, the world's most advanced chips today are almost exclusively manufactured in Taiwan, where one company, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, buys the majority of the world's extreme ultraviolet lithography tools and a large share of its wafers and produces almost all of the advanced processor chips that we rely on. I would wager a bet that every single one of you has a Taiwanese chip in your pocket right now. Because TSMC, this singular Taiwanese company, produces over 90% of the world's advanced processor chips, smartphone chips, PC chips, chips in the telecoms network, and most importantly, 99% of the world's AI processors, including all of the chips produced by NVIDIA, the world's largest company, all of the chips processing AI at OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, and almost all of the other AI chips used by any company in the world. In other words, we stand at a unique moment in world history. And as a historian, I don't say that very often. But never before has an industrial revolution like AI depended not just on a single continent, nor on a single country, nor even on a single company, but on just 2 factories, which in Taiwan produce the world's most advanced semiconductors. The entire technological ecosystem depends on a tiny production base in Taiwan, where this singular company has unique know-how to make advanced chips that nobody else in the world can replicate. And people have tried, and failed, which is why TSMC is the most valuable publicly traded company in Asia, and I would argue the most important company of any sorts in the world. And the fact that it sits in Taiwan, which the United States has pledged to defend by force, and which China considers a renegade province, means that it's impossible to separate the semiconductor supply chain from the United States-China competition and China's ambitions to control Taiwan. Now, China has, of course, wanted to control Taiwan since 1949, when the Communist Party first took control of China. But since that time, China's military capabilities have grown every single year. And now it seems that China is poised to develop the capabilities it would need to seize Taiwan. And if it ever chose to do so, the implications for the semiconductor supply chain, and therefore the entire world economy, would be profound. If it were to knock offline semiconductor production in Taiwan, the world's largest companies could barely function. And if it were to seize control of the factories in Taiwan, it would have a strategic asset of unparalleled importance. Which is why the semiconductor issue is not just an issue for chatbots, nor an issue for all of you as you play with your phone or send messages. It's an issue that is fundamentally important for negotiations between President Trump and President Xi, between the world's 2 most powerful powers as they face off for geopolitical primacy in the Indo-Pacific region, and I would argue around the world. There's a linkage, in other words, between the world's most important geopolitical rivalry, the chips that make AI possible, and the semiconductors that our entire manufacturing base rely on. They're all produced in Taiwan, in a factory, or in 2 factories rather, that are certainly being targeted by Beijing and barely controlled today by the Western alliance. When I wrote Chip War, I called it Chip War, partly alluding to the contest between companies to make the most advanced semiconductors. But it was also an allusion to the central role that AI will play and that computing has played in defense and intelligence capabilities that have been developed over the last 75 years, increasingly relying on computing power. I hope it's not an allusion to a conflict that might emerge between China and Taiwan in the future, though I think all must admit that a conflict there is more likely now than it's been at any point since the 1950s. All of which means that we cannot think about technology issues or AI policy without putting the geopolitical competition at the side. And it also means that artificial intelligence will be a critical factor in shaping this geopolitical competition, even as it's also highly at risk from the outcome. And this is particularly important because when the United States and China both think about how to exert military power in the Taiwan Straits, they're increasingly thinking about deploying AI systems to do so. Now, we know from detailed research by scholars who have analyzed the types of material that the People's Liberation Army of China want to buy that China is trying to acquire as many AI-enabled systems as possible, and they're open. They talk, for example, about the drones that they're building and acquiring that can fly themselves, or the electronic warfare systems that are capable of jamming enemy communications automatically. In other words, applying AI to conflict is central to the Chinese strategy to gain an edge over the United States in the Indo-Pacific. The United States is now equally open about its goal to apply artificial intelligence to secure its position in the Taiwan Straits and the Indo-Pacific more broadly. For over a decade, the Pentagon has been experimenting with ways to use artificial intelligence first in an effort to sift through intelligence more effectively, to identify in satellite photos, for example, what's a truck versus what's a tank. But increasingly, the United States, just like China, just like Russia, just like Ukraine, is deploying AI in systems to let them make decisions increasingly semi-autonomously. And just like cars are slowly but surely becoming more semi-autonomous, braking themselves, identifying objects on the road, helping you decide when to change lanes and when not to, so too drones are becoming increasingly semi-autonomous. Movement in their sensory interpretation, and not in the future, I don't think, in their targeting as well. In other words, as the United States and China face off over Taiwan, in no small part because Taiwan is the only country in the world that can produce the chips that AI requires, so too they're both betting on AI as the factor that will give them an advantage in the military. There's a deep interlinkage between Taiwan's status in the battleground and its role in providing the AI capabilities that both China and the United States will rely on. For now, it seems to me that the United States has an advantage because the chips that make AI possible are produced with a supply chain that inevitably touches the United States. Parts of every chip-making tool, for example, are made in the United States. The most advanced AI chips are designed by U.S. companies. And the United States wields substantial influence over the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company because Taiwan is so dependent on U.S. support. And so the U.S. has been, over the last several years, trying to choke off China's access to advanced AI chips, to limit the ability of Chinese tech firms to harness computing, and it hopes in so doing to slow China's progress in artificial intelligence. The bet that the United States is making now is similar to the bet that it made over the past several decades. The bet's simple. America's primary advantage is in computing power, producing it and deploying it at scale. During the Cold War, the U.S. had a profound advantage in producing computing power over the Soviet Union, its primary rival. Over the past several decades, it's been U.S. firms that have been the most important drivers in innovations in designing and manufacturing computer chips. And even today, although China is the manufacturing workshop of the world, and it can manufacture almost everything domestically, it still can't produce cutting-edge chips at scale. It's trying to, but it's still far from it. Best estimates suggest that China will produce 5% of the AI computing power that Taiwan will manufacture next year. A tiny fraction for the second largest country in the world. And so for now, the US, coupled with its allies in Europe and in Japan and its partners in Taiwan, have a unique advantage, perhaps our only really durable technological advantage over China in the production of computing. We produce far more of it than our rivals. We're producing more of it every single year as Moore's law continues, delivering better chips. And as a result, we've been a leader in both developing artificial intelligence systems and there's a race underway in a race that the world's two largest economies are running in, devoting billions of dollars in research and development expenses to try to gain a better position in. And a race that will have implications far beyond the world's AI companies or the chatbots that we now use. A race that will transform the way military power is wielded. A race that will have a major impact on the stability or lack thereof in the Taiwan Straits. And a race that I think will be perhaps the most important factor in shaping the future of the world, technologically, geopolitically, economically. Because it seems to me that all trend lines suggest that just like over the past 75 years, where you couldn't understand how the world was changing without putting computing power at the center of your analysis, the same is true today. You can't understand AI without computing power. You can't understand the world economy, international trade without computing power, and nor can you understand military power without computing power. Because today, like most of the last 75 years, the singular most important force changing how power is exercised in the world stage is semiconductor. So with that, I'd like to thank you for having me and welcome any questions. Raise your hand and stand on you. Please.
Do you think the U.S. should suspend the sale of GPUs to China, such as NVIDIA C100?
The question was whether the United States should suspend sales of advanced chips to China. The United States has been doing this for the past 3 years, not allowing the most advanced chips produced by NVIDIA to go to China on the fears that these chips will be used to train AI systems that will not just have economic importance, but also military importance. And my view is that this is the right policy, is that China doesn't have the capability to produce comparable chips domestically at any sort of scale. As I mentioned, China's going to produce around 5% of the computing power that the US and Taiwan will collectively produce next year and the year after. And that if China doesn't have the most advanced chips, it will struggle to build and deploy the most advanced AI systems. So yes, I think this is the right policy. Please.
Do you think that in the near future, generation obsolete, which will allow China to catch up and
The question was whether we should expect innovation in semiconductors to plateau, and if so, what this would mean for U.S.-China competition. As I mentioned, there's been a trend since the mid-1960s of doubling in capacity every 2 years. There's been multiple drivers of this doubling. One of the key drivers has been shrinking transistors two-dimensionally. So when the first transistors were produced in the late 1940s, you could see them in the naked eye. Today, as I mentioned, the transistors in an advanced chip are smaller than the size of a coronavirus. And there's only so much further you can shrink before you hit literally atomic levels. And so I think there's a consensus that two-dimensional shrinking is going to end at some point. Not next year, not the year after, but by the middle of the 2030s, it will be harder to shrink much further two-dimensionally. However, there are other axes of improvement. We're just beginning to stack transistors three-dimensionally. There's a long way we can go in terms of stacking. There are ways chips can be designed differently for different use cases. If you, for example, compare a chip that NVIDIA produces for AI with other chips that are produced for different applications, the reason NVIDIA's chips are better is because they're designed specifically for AI applications. And we now have chips that are designed specifically for self-driving cars or specifically for other types of use cases. And as we deploy AI throughout the economy, we will have more specially designed chips that will have huge performance improvements that come from that design specification. In addition, we're finding ways to bring different types of chips together. Traditionally, you'd have a processor chip put next to a memory chip. The memory chip would remember the data, the processor chip would process it. And you connect those chips with copper wires, which would send electrons between the two chips. That was the data going back and forth. But electrons move through copper too slowly for the computing power that your smartphone would require. And so, again, in the not-too-distant future, we will replace copper interconnections with optical interconnections, which will send photons, not electrons, and photons are more prevalent at the speed of light. So much more rapid interconnections between different types of chips, again, give you a step change in computing performance. All of this, to me, suggests that there are multiple axes of improvement, and that the scope of improvement along each of these axes will be substantial. And so if you ask me to bet, would I bet on the overall rate of progress slowing? I would say not anytime soon. And indeed, I think the incentive to find ways to produce better semiconductors is today higher than it's been. One final question, please. All right, let's take two final questions.
So recently I've heard a lot of hype about quantum computing, and I'm just interested to hear your opinion on whether that would be a factor in the near future, and also to know anything about the quantum industry now. I would like to hear your thoughts.
The question was about quantum computing and its impact on the computing industry. I find that most people think quantum computing is a replacement for classical computing, but I think it's smarter to think of it as a supplement or a complement to classical computing. The reality is that the types of calculations we undertake with our existing computing infrastructure are different than the types of calculations you would use a quantum computing for. Quantum computing will not make your Instagram likes faster. It will not make ChatGPT faster. But it does do other types of calculations vastly more efficiently. And in particular, types of calculations that require modeling quantum dynamics. So for example, understanding material science, where random variation makes it very hard to simulate, is a place where quantum computers are expected to be much, much better than traditional computers. For drug discovery and pharmaceutical research, there's an expectation that quantum capabilities will be much, much more capable. And for cryptology and de-encrypting encrypted data, quantum computers will be much, much more capable than existing computing. What that means is that when the first quantum computers arrive, most people now think around 2030 or the early 2030s we will have practically usable quantum computers. They will not replace any of the existing computing we're undertaking, but they will open up entire new domains where it's been completely implausible to undertake calculations today using existing computing infrastructure. We'll have new capabilities that quantum systems will enable. With that, I'd like to thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miller. It was a timely and important and fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Please stand for our flag. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Class 1.
manufactured.